We ask that they put their hands on their hips to avoid compensations like arm swings where they're going to generate a lot of momentum. We also want to avoid them doing things like where they kind of go up onto their toes and drop, because that's also going to influence the way we move through it. And when we get them doing the jump, we want to make sure that in the air, they're nice and straight. So they're trying to achieve full extension through the legs. They're trying to point their toes through the ground and put their head through the roof and not tucking up in the air, because that will also influence their strategy. So it's important that we're consistent and it's important that they're jumping well for us to collect good data. So Ella, I'm going to ask you initially just to jump as high as you can, okay? So I just want you to think about trying to get the maximum height. So keep your hands on your hips. I'm going to count you in 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to get you to jump as high as you can, okay? 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so on that jump, you might have noticed that she dropped very quickly, which is good, but she also slammed her heel on the ground on that right side, and that's definitely going to appear in the force trace. And it's going to give us some unusual data, which is going to be hard to interpret. So it's important we ask them to keep their feet flat on the ground. Another thing that's really important is that when we're trying to measure certain metrics like the eccentric deceleration phase, we need to cue them to drop fast. So Ella did quite a good job of that, but she's done loads of these before. A lot of the time when you ask people just to jump high, they'll do a very long, slow, eccentric phase and then explode up in the air. So they get a lot of depth, which gives them a really good runner. But what it means is we get quite a slow eccentric phase. And I'll talk about some metrics that helps us measure that in a moment. So Ella, could you try and just do like what I was talking, a long, slow jump, but try and get as high as you can. Okay, so we're getting quite a lot of depth. But basically, as we get to the bottom of that counter movement, we're not moving very fast. So it becomes a very concentrically driven counter movement jump, whereas we want to look at some of the key metrics in that eccentric phase, which I'll show you a little bit later. So what I'm going to get you to do now is I want you to think about jumping as high as you can, but I want you to move as fast as you can through each phase. So I want you to drop down, I want you to explode up in the air, and then I want you to land soft, okay? I'm going to count you in. 3, 2, 1, go. Good. So you notice she didn't get quite as deep there, but she really attacked that down phase. We get to that point where she transitions from eccentric to concentric, which is one of the key metrics we look at. And then she exploded up in the air and had a nice soft landing. Can I get you to do a few more of those? So nice and tall, nice and still. 3, 2, 1, go. Good. It's also important that we stand nice and still before we do our counter movement jumps, or any jumps for that matter. We want a nice, clear force trace so that the software can pick up the start of the movement. If we're moving around, it can sometimes give an inaccurate starting point, which is obviously going to have a knock-on effect for all the metrics that we look at. So I'm going to get you to go again. So we're going to stand nice and tall, nice straight legs, as still as you can, jumping as high as you can, moving as fast as you can. 3, 2, 1, go. Excellent. So when we're reviewing the jumps during the assessment process, there's a couple of things that we want to look at just to make sure that they're kind of jumping the way that we want to and consistently. So one of the first things that we can look at is peak eccentric velocity. So peak eccentric velocity is essentially measuring how fast Ella drops. So we spoke about the importance of getting her to really attack that downward phase and basically load and recoil like a spring. At this stage, Ella, in a couple of her jumps, was moving at negative 1.39 meters per second, which is quite a fast eccentric velocity. So that's what we want. A slower eccentric velocity would usually be under negative 0.1 or negative 1.1. So usually we want to hit that target as a minimum requirement, just so we can say that they've had a good eccentric phase and we can actually look at the data within that phase. Other things that we look at are counter movement depth. Now, this is a bit more of a zone rather than a set number we're looking for. So, and it's not a perfect science, but essentially a counter movement depth of only 20 centimeters would be considered quite shallow, whereas a counter movement depth of over 35 centimeters will be considered quite deep, which is potentially going to mean that she's loading quite slow and long into that phase. So if we look at Ella's just initial kind of jump, she's got an eccentric velocity of negative 1.39 or negative 1.4, and she's got a counter movement depth of negative 24.5 centimeters. So that's a good eccentric phase, which means that we can kind of look at the impulses and metrics around that phase with a bit of confidence. The way we often describe this is if people are moving slow or if they're not moving deep enough or if they're moving too deep. It's kind of like testing the brakes in your car moving at 20 kilometers an hour. It doesn't really tell us how they're going to hold up. So the faster they're moving, getting to that kind of mid-range depth, it gives us a bit of confidence that they're actually moving with a bit of speed, and anything we see there is going to at least give us some information about how they might move if we get into a more intense and chaotic environment like what we would see out on a sporting field or a netball court. Okay. The next jump we're going to look at in terms of assessment is a single leg hop or a single leg counter movement jump. Now, a lot of the time this is viewed as a progression or a more intense jump than the double leg counter movement. We're moving from 2 legs to 1 leg. And that is certainly the case in terms of the load put on the knee. However, we get good information from both of these. So one thing that's important to know is that when you do go to a single leg hop, you're moving at a much slower velocity. You've effectively doubled the amount of weight on that leg. So what we see is that you're moving a lot slower, particularly in that eccentric phase and that concentric phase. So it's a heavier load, but at a much lower velocity. The other thing that we see is that because of the load, we get to a much lower a much shallower depth when we're doing our hop. And a lot of the time people can kind of just do a little bit of a knee bob and then kind of muscle their way out of it and relying on their calf strength. So sometimes sometimes we will see that their single leg hop doesn't look too bad and we only see these minor asymmetries. Whereas when we do a double leg one, we're getting into a much deeper movement. We're getting into more knee flexion. We're moving at a faster velocity and it can reveal a little bit more information. So both of them have a place throughout the entire rehabilitation process. And it's not just we kind of tick one box and move on to the next, okay? When we're doing our single leg counter movement jump, it's really critical that we get our testing set up perfect because there's a lot more opportunities to compensate when we do something single leg. So Ella, if I can get you to stand on your right leg, so your unaffected leg, hands are always on our hips. That's just to stop us kind of throwing our body up in the air and generating momentum from a trunk and an arm swing. So I'm going to get you to just stand as you are, hands on your hips, and I want you to jump as high as you can, and I want you to move as fast as you can. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. So what you'll notice there is Ella's left leg swung back behind her, her shoulders came forward, and she was able to generate a lot of momentum from kind of a hip and a trunk swing. So even though we'd taken the arms out of the equation, it's likely that was quite a high jump because she'd driven a lot of that from her hip, which is fine if we're just trying to measure how high someone jumps. But really what we're trying to use this test for is a surrogate for measuring that kind of explosive quality around the knee. So we want to try and constrain the movement so that we're really targeting the knee and we're not giving it opportunities to avoid it. So Ella, what I'm going to get you to do is the same thing. I'm going to get you to start nice and tall, nice and still. But I want you to bring this knee up to about 80 degrees hip flexion. So you don't need to jam it all the way up. And I want you to keep it in front the whole time. So I'm going to count you in again. 3, 2, 1, go. So what we saw with this one is that Ella's chest was a lot more upright. It forced her to use her knee. So again, for ACL patients, we're trying to measure around the knee. So we want them to make sure that they're actually using it and not compensating through the hip. If we look at the jump heights between the two, so the first one, we had a jump height of 12 centimeters. The second one, we had a jump height of 11 centimeters. So you're going to find that it's a little bit lower when you constrain it in this way, but you're also going to find that you get much greater asymmetries between the affected and the unaffected side. So it's really important when we do that. Other things that we look at, very similar to the double leg counter movement jump, is we look at the counter movement depth. So 15 centimeters is kind of right in the middle. Usually 10 centimeters would be considered a shallow single leg counter movement jump or single leg hop. And then getting into kind of 20 centimeters would be a deeper and probably a lot slower. So kind of in the middle of that usually works well. In terms of our peak eccentric velocity, usually the target we aim for is around negative 0.7. So as you can see, it's nearly half what we get from the double leg counter movement jump. And again, that's just telling us that Ella's willing to get into a bit of depth when she does the movement. She's moving quickly and then she's exploding up and we're getting a good jump measure from there.